The black SUV had tinted windows so dark Paige couldn't see through them, and she'd stopped trying somewhere around the 40-minute mark. She kept her hands folded in her lap, the way her mother used to tell her to sit in church. Still, quiet, take up as little space as possible. The man in the passenger seat hadn't said a word since they'd left the hospital parking garage. Neither had the driver. They didn't need to. The gun holstered at the first man's hip said everything. She thought about her brother, 16 years old and already hooked to more machines than a person should ever have to be. The doctors at Toronto General had used words like degenerative and progressive, and without intervention in the same breath, and she'd stood there in the corridor, squeezing the strap of her bag so hard her fingers went numb. The intervention they were describing cost $240,000. Her savings account held $412. Then a man named Crest Aldgate had come to see her at the hospital. Not her brother's floor, but the cafeteria, where she'd been eating a granola bar for dinner and pretending it was fine. He had silver at his temples and a suit that cost more than her rent, and he'd slid a folder across the table before she'd said a single word. "Your brother is Eli's son," he'd said, "which means he's Mr. Sterling's nephew." She hadn't known what that meant then. She understood it better now, watching the city give way to forest, and the forest give way to a gate, iron and tall, swinging open like it had been expecting her. The estate was in the Muskoka region, or at least that's what she'd clocked from the highway signs, before the driver had taken a series of turns she couldn't track. The main house sat at the end of a gravel lane lined with birch trees, white trunks catching the headlights. It was the kind of house that appeared in architectural magazines. 3 stories, stone and timber, all the lights on the lower floor burning. Crest opened her door before she could do it herself. "Mr. Sterling will see you in the morning," he said. "Tonight you'll be shown to your room. Your duties begin tomorrow at 7. Paige Dunmore picked up her bag and followed him inside. The housekeeper who walked her upstairs was a small woman named Mrs. Holt, who did not smile but was not unkind. She pointed out the linen closet, the bathroom at the end of the hall, and the door Paige was not to open under any circumstances. "The one with the keypad on the frame, third on the left. That's Mr. Sterling's son's room," Mrs. Holt said without elaborating. "How old is the child?" 8. Mrs. Holt paused, her hand on the doorframe of Paige's room. "He doesn't speak, not to strangers, sometimes not at all." She said it the way people say things they've stopped expecting to change. That night, Paige lay on top of the bed covers fully dressed and stared at the ceiling. She'd signed something, pages of something, in that fluorescent-lit office at the base of the gate, and Crest had told her the arrangement was simple. She would serve as a household assistant. She would be available for tasks the regular staff were not suited for. She would not discuss the family, the property, or anything she witnessed with anyone outside these walls. In exchange, the cost of her brother's treatment would be covered in full. She told herself that made it simple. She told herself she'd done harder things. She wasn't sure she believed either. In the morning, the house was already moving. Someone was in the kitchen before 6. She could hear it from the back staircase. The sound of a pan setting down too hard, the hiss of something hitting heat. She followed the smell of coffee and found a boy sitting at the kitchen island. He was small for 8. Or maybe he only seemed that way because he was curled into himself, shoulders hunched, feet hooked around the stool legs. He had dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of serious expression that didn't belong on a child's face. In front of him was a bowl of cereal going soggy untouched. He looked up when she came in. Paige stopped. "Hi," she said. He stared. "I'm Paige. I'm new." He looked back at his cereal. She poured herself a coffee, found a mug without having to ask, and sat down 2 stools away, not close enough to crowd him. She didn't say anything else. She drank her coffee and he let his cereal go soggier, and it was the most companionable silence she'd had in weeks. A door opened somewhere, and the temperature of the room changed. She'd been told Damon Sterling ran 3 import companies, 2 investment funds, and something that Crest had referred to only as legacy business with no further explanation. She'd been told he was 41, and that he'd been raising his son alone since the boy was 3. What she had not been told was that he was the kind of man who made a room feel smaller just by entering it. He was tall. Not in a soft way. He stood in the kitchen doorway in a dark shirt with the sleeves already rolled up and looked at her the way she imagined he looked at spreadsheets, measuring, not particularly interested, moving on. "Dunmore," he said. "Mr. Sterling." He walked past her to the coffee maker. "Crest said you have a background in child development. I have a degree in it. And 3 years working with nonverbal kids at a clinic in Kitchener." He poured his coffee and turned around. His eyes went to his son, who had still not eaten his cereal. Something crossed his face, just a flicker, gone before she could name it. "Theo doesn't respond well to new people," he said. She almost said, "I noticed." She said, "That's all right." He looked at her for a moment longer, then he picked up his coffee and walked out. The first week, Paige learned the rhythm of the house the way you learn the currents of a new lake, slowly with your feet. Mornings were Sterling's, the house holding its breath while he moved through it. He left before 8, returned after 7, sometimes later. The hours between belonged to Theo and the staff, though belonged was generous. Theo disappeared into his room for stretches of time so long that Paige would find herself listening at his door just to confirm he was still there. He was always there. She could hear him through the door. Not words, but sounds, a kind of soft percussion, rhythmic. On the 4th day, she knocked. Silence. Theo, I'm going to walk down to the dock. I thought you might want to come. More silence. I'm going whether you come or not, she said. It might be cold. She waited. Then she went. She was sitting at the end of the dock with her feet over the water, watching 2 loons pass when she heard the boards shift behind her. She didn't turn around. After a minute, Theo sat down 2 feet to her left, feet dangling the way hers were. They watched the loons until the loons were gone. She didn't call it progress, she just let it be what it was. In the 2nd week, she found the folder. It wasn't snooping. She'd been asked to take a package of files to Sterling's study, and the folder had been sitting on his desk in plain sight, a single photograph paper-clipped to the front. A woman, younger than Paige had expected, laughing at something just off camera. Dark eyes, dark hair, beautiful in the way people are beautiful when they don't know they're being looked at. Underneath the photograph, a medical report. She read just enough before she stopped herself. Theo's mother had died when he was 3, not an accident. Something prolonged and agonizing, and, if she'd read the top line right, misdiagnosed for over a year. She set the package on the desk and left without touching anything else. That night, Sterling came home late. She was still in the kitchen, not because she'd been waiting. She'd been doing nothing in particular, reading at the kitchen table, unable to sleep, and he came in through the side door with his jacket over his arm and stopped when he saw her. You're up, he said. Couldn't sleep. She closed her book. There's pasta from dinner. Mrs. Holt left it in the fridge. He set his jacket on the hook. For a moment she thought he'd just go upstairs, but he opened the fridge and stood there looking at the containers. She got up and put the kettle on, and neither of them said anything, and she heated the pasta while the kettle came to a boil. She put the bowl in front of him. He ate. She drank her tea. She kept her voice neutral, like she was reporting the weather. Sterling's fork stopped. Not words, she said. He made a sound, repeated it. Sterling was quiet for a moment. What was it? A pattern he was tapping on the dock railing. I tapped it back. He changed it. I changed mine to match. We went back and forth for about 10 minutes. She wrapped both hands around her mug. He's communicating. He has a system. It's just not the one people have been expecting. Sterling set down his fork. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not disbelief, not quite. Something more careful than that. Every specialist we've taken him to says the same thing, he said. Verbal development may come with time, patience, and... I know what they say. She said it. I've heard those reports, but I'm not sure the goal should be verbal. I think the goal should be connection. He's already connecting. He just needs someone to connect back on his terms. The room was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. What are you suggesting? Sterling asked. Let me work with him, not as staff, as someone who's specifically focused on him. I can put together an approach based on where he actually is, not where the reports say he should be. He picked up his fork again. She thought that was the end of it. Send me a summary, he said. I'll read it. She nodded once and took her mug upstairs. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't no. The threat came from somewhere she didn't expect, which was everywhere. She learned that in the 3rd week, when Crest called her to the gate office and closed the door, and told her with the same flat politeness he used for everything that there had been a security incident at the perimeter, and that she should not leave the property without an escort. What kind of incident? She asked. The kind Mr. Sterling manages, Crest said. She went back to the house. She found Theo in the garden, sitting in the grass with a stick, drawing something in the dirt. She sat down beside him. He was drawing circles, dozens of them overlapping. She picked up a stick of her own and drew a circle around his circles. He drew one around hers. She thought about her brother, his voice on the phone the night before, thin but clear. The nurses here are really nice, Paige. They let me watch hockey. She thought about all the things she'd agreed to. She thought about the photograph on Sterling's desk, the woman who'd been misdiagnosed, the year she'd given the wrong treatment, while the right one sat somewhere in a file no one had read carefully enough. She called the hospital that evening, not Theo's doctor, but the external specialist she'd flagged a week ago, the one whose work she'd read in a journal article, the one who'd written specifically about children with Theo's presentation. It took her 4 calls to get through. When she finally did, she sat in the garden in the dark and talked for 45 minutes. When she came inside, Sterling was standing in the hall. "Who are you talking to?" he asked. "Not threatening. A specialist, Dr. Amara Ose. She works out of McMaster. I think Theo should see her." She didn't flinch from his gaze. "I know that's not in my official. I know I'm not supposed to. But I think what he needs isn't available here, and I think this woman can help, and I needed to make the call before I could ask permission because she's nearly impossible to reach." Sterling looked at her for a long time. "And if I say no, then I'll have wasted 45 minutes of a doctor's time." Something shifted in his face. Not softening, exactly. More like a wall that had stopped expecting to hold. "What did she say?" he asked. Paige pulled out her phone and turned it toward him. She'd taken notes. Bullet points, specific and detailed. Dr. Ose's words in quotation marks. He read it. He read it twice. "Get Crest to arrange the trip," he said, and walked away. The fourth week was harder than the first three. Something in the business, whatever that meant, whatever Sterling's business actually was, had gone sideways. She knew this not because anyone told her, but because the house said it. The conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the cars that came and went at unusual hours, Sterling's face pulling into something harder and colder each day, the way Crest answered his phone before the second ring. She kept to the parts of the house she was supposed to keep to. She kept her head down. She kept Theo busy. He'd started making sounds directed at her. Not words, still, but specific. A low note when he wanted her to follow him, a sharper sound when he found something interesting. She learned them the way you learn a new language by living in a country. Not by studying the rules, but by existing inside them. One afternoon he pulled her sleeve toward the window and made his low note. Outside, 3 men she didn't recognize were standing with Crest near the garage. She moved them away from the window. She took Theo to the kitchen and made hot chocolate and put on the record player. There was one in the sitting room, old and impractical. But he loved it, and she let Motown fill up the house while whatever was happening in the garage happened without them. That night, Sterling found her in the library. He'd been drinking, not drunk. Just the careful version of loosened that people allow themselves when things have gone badly and they don't know what else to do. He had a glass of something amber in his hand, and he leaned against the doorframe and looked at her like she was something he was trying to categorize. "Theo hasn't had a meltdown in 11 days, he said. She kept her place in her book with her thumb. "I know, that hasn't happened in 2 years. The percussion helps," she said. "He needs pattern. Predictability. The schedule changes were." She stopped. "Sorry, you didn't ask for an explanation. I'm listening." He crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from her. Not close. The safe geometry of the library between them. She explained what she'd observed. He asked a question she hadn't expected. Detailed, specific, showing he'd read everything she'd sent. She answered it. He asked another. They talked for an hour, and somewhere in that hour the conversation shifted from Theo to other things. Not personal things, not warm things, but real things. He told her about a city he'd done business in that she'd always wanted to see. She told him about her brother, briefly, the pieces of it that didn't require context she couldn't give. He didn't pity her. That was the thing. He listened the way he seemed to do everything. Measuring, direct, no performance. She found she didn't mind it. The danger arrived on a Tuesday, which somehow made it worse. Tuesdays were meant to be ordinary. She'd just put Theo down for the night and come downstairs to find Crest in the kitchen with 2 men she'd seen before. Security, she'd gathered, though she'd never been told their names. And all 3 of them were looking at a map spread on the table. They stopped when she walked in. "Miss Dunmore," Crest said, "you should stay upstairs tonight." She looked at the map. She couldn't see details, but she could see a red line traced along what looked like a road she recognized. The road that ran past the property's eastern edge. "Is Theo safe?" she asked. "Yes." "Is anyone going to tell me what's happening?" "No," Crest said. Not unkind, just certain. She went back upstairs. She sat in the chair in Theo's room, in the dark, and listened to him breathe. She thought about leaving. She thought about what Crest had said the day she arrived. The arrangement is simple. And how nothing about the past 4 weeks had been simple at all. Around midnight she heard Sterling's voice in the hall, low and controlled, then a silence, then footsteps. Her door opened. He stood in the doorway. He looked at her sitting in the chair and at Theo asleep in the bed, and something happened to his face that she didn't have a name for yet. "You stayed," he said. "He was scared earlier," she said, "before I got him down." The noise outside. Sterling was quiet. "Whatever's happening," she said, "he knows something is wrong. Kids always do." He stepped into the room. He stood looking at his son for a long time. Then he sat down on the floor with his back against the wall. Not her chair, the floor, and he put his arms on his knees, and he was quiet. She didn't say anything. He didn't leave. They sat in the dark until Sterling's breathing changed, and she realized he'd fallen asleep with his back against his son's bedroom wall. And she thought, there it is. That's who you actually are. She stayed until the sky started to lighten. Then she went to her own room and slept for 3 hours and was back before 7. Dr. Amara Osei drove up from Hamilton on a Wednesday. She was brisk and thorough, and she spoke to Theo in a way that showed she understood immediately that direct questions were not the entry point. She sat on the floor. She waited. She let Theo come to her, and when he did, cautiously, after 20 minutes, with a stick in his hand, she held out her hand and let him place it. She spent 4 hours in the house. When she came to the kitchen table where Paige and Sterling were waiting, she set down her notes and took off her reading glasses and said, "The previous assessments treated his silence as a deficit. I don't think it is. I think this child has a very specific way of processing the world, and no one has built toward it. With the right support, I expect to see substantial communication development within the year. Not necessarily verbal, but communication, full and functional." Sterling's jaw moved, just once. "What does he need?" he asked. Dr. Osei looked at Paige. "He needs what he's apparently been getting the last few weeks," she said. "More of it, consistent, and he needs us to stop waiting for him to meet us, where we are." After Dr. Osei left, Sterling stood in the hall for a long time. Paige was going to walk past him, give him the space to have whatever the moment was, but he said her name before she could. "Paige." She stopped. "I know why you're here," he said. "I know it wasn't choice." He was looking at the wall, not her. "Crest told me about your brother, about the arrangement." "I know he did," she said. "That doesn't change." He stopped, started again. "I want you to know the arrangement holds. Your brother's treatment. That's not contingent on anything." She looked at him. "On what?" He turned, finally. He met her eyes, and she saw that the thing on his face was the same thing that had been there when he'd looked at Theo sleeping. Not the business version of him, not the man who scared people with how still he could stand, but the one who'd fallen asleep on his kid's floor. "On whether you stay," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Are you asking me to? I'm telling you the door isn't locked. And I'm asking you to consider that there might be reasons to stay that didn't exist when you arrived." She thought about her brother, who had texted her that morning. The doctors said the first treatment worked. Paige. First one worked, with 3 exclamation marks and a typo he hadn't bothered to fix, which meant he'd been excited. She thought about Theo, who that morning had made a new sound she hadn't heard before, 2 notes rising, which she'd come to understand was the sound he made when he wanted her to look at something with him. She thought about the man standing in front of her, who had fallen asleep on a hardwood floor rather than leave his son. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Something in Sterling's face settled. Not relief, exactly. More like a person who has been holding a very specific kind of tension, finally allowing themselves to stop. "Good," he said. He walked past her toward his study. She stood in the hall a moment longer, looking at the birch trees through the tall window at the end of the corridor. White trunks, still as paper. Then she went upstairs, because Theo would be waking up in 20 minutes, and he liked it when she was there when he did. 3 months later, on a Saturday in late September when the lake was still and the trees had gone fully gold, Theo stood at the end of the dock and said a word. She heard it from 6 feet behind him. She'd learned to give him those 6 feet, to stay close enough that he knew she was there, but far enough that the world didn't feel like it was closing in. He was looking at the loons, 2 of them, back again after weeks of absence. He raised his arm and pointed and made his low note, the one that meant look, and then, after a beat of silence that stretched the way silences do when something is about to change, he said it. "Birds." It came out careful, deliberate, like something he'd been holding in his chest for a long time and had decided just now to let go. Paige pressed her hand over her mouth. She didn't cry. She stood very still and she said quietly, as normally as she could manage, "Yeah, they're back." He looked at her over his shoulder. His face was serious, the way it always was, but his eyes were different, something in them that she'd only ever seen in glimpses, when she'd tapped back his rhythm, when she'd drawn a circle around his circles. It was the look of a person who has been heard. She turned to find Sterling standing at the end of the dock behind her. She didn't know when he'd come out. He was very still, and she could see from here that his jaw was tight, and his eyes. She hadn't seen him look like that before, like something in him had broken open, and he wasn't sure yet if it was all right. She walked back toward him. She didn't think about it. She just did. He reached out and took her hand and held it, and they both stood there looking at his son pointing at the loons on the water. "You did that," Sterling said. His voice was quiet, rough at the edges. "He did that," she said. "I just learned how to listen." The dock shifted slightly in a current. Theo had turned back to the water. He lifted his arm again, the same gesture, and said the word a second time, more certain now, like he was practicing the shape of it and finding it fit. Birds. The lake was very still. The birches on the far shore stood white and quiet. The sky was the particular shade of blue that only happens in Ontario in September, a color that feels like it won't last, which is what makes you look at it. Paige felt Sterling's hand around hers, steady and certain, and she let herself stand in the moment without pulling away from it, without measuring it, without protecting herself from it, without planning what came next. For the first time in a long time, the next thing could wait.